Hey, my name is Owen Barrett. I'm 33 years old and I run a small hardware store on 3rd Street in Millbrook, Ohio, the kind of place with a bell over the door that hasn't worked right since 1994. I'm telling you that so you understand what kind of man I am, because the night everything changed, I was standing behind a woman in the checkout line at Harper's Market with a bag of drywall screws in my hand and absolutely nothing interesting about my life. It was a Tuesday in late November. The heaters over the doors were blowing that dry, hot air that makes your eyes itch. The woman in front of me had a little girl holding onto her coat pocket, and she was buying the kind of groceries you buy when you're doing math in your head: bread, eggs, a jar of peanut butter, a box of store brand rice, two bananas, not a bunch, two, torn off and weighed separately, and a small blue inhaler box that the cashier had to unlock from behind the counter. She swiped her card. The machine made that flat, ugly sound. She swiped it again. The cashier, a kid named Tyler who couldn't have been 19, said, "Ma'am, it's saying declined." She said, "Can you try it one more time?" And her voice was perfectly steady, which somehow made it worse. The third time, the line behind me had grown to 4 people, and one of them sighed loud enough to be heard 3 aisles over. She started taking things off the belt, not fast, not embarrassed, just methodically, the way you do something you've done before. The rice went back, the peanut butter went back. Her hand hovered over the inhaler and then moved past it to the eggs. The little girl looked up at her and didn't say anything at all, and that's the part I still can't shake, because a 5-year-old who doesn't ask why has already learned something no 5-year-old should know. I heard myself say, "I've got it." She turned around. And I want to be honest with you, because if I make myself sound noble here, the whole story falls apart. I wasn't being brave. I was standing in a grocery store with $41 of screws in my hand, and I simply could not watch it happen. She was maybe 28, dark hair pulled back so tight it looked like it hurt, and a canvas bag hanging off her shoulder that she was holding with both hands even though her card was still in the machine. She said, "No, thank you, but no." I said, "It's fine." She said, "It isn't fine, it's charity." And there was steel in it. So I said the only thing that was true. It's $40, and my grandmother would climb out of her grave and hit me with a broom. Something in her face cracked, just slightly. Tyler was staring at us. The man behind me sighed again. She looked at the little girl. She looked at the inhaler box on the counter, and she gave one small nod, so short you'd have missed it if you blinked. I tapped my card, $52.18. The receipt printed, Tyler bagged everything and slid it across, and I picked up two of the bags because she had the girl's hand in one of hers, and that canvas bag in the other, and I walked them out into the parking lot where the wind was coming straight down 3rd Street like it had a grudge. Her car was an old gray Corolla parked under the burned-out light at the far end of the lot. I set the bags in the trunk, and when I straightened up, she was standing very close to me, closer than a stranger stands, and she was looking at me with an expression I couldn't read at all. Then she leaned in and said something so quietly I almost didn't catch it. She said, "Please don't look in my bag." I said, "What?" She said it again, barely moving her lips. "Please don't look in my bag. Whatever you think you're being kind about, just don't look in it. Don't ask." Then she got in the car with her daughter and drove away. And I stood in that parking lot in the cold, holding a bag of drywall screws, watching her taillights turn onto Warren Avenue, and I had absolutely no idea that I'd just met the woman I was going to spend the rest of my life with. But let me take you back, because none of this makes sense unless you know what I was before that Tuesday. I grew up in this town. My mother left when I was 4, and my father followed her out the door a year later in a different direction. And my grandmother, Ruth, raised me above this exact hardware store in the apartment with the slanted floor and the radiator that clanks like someone's trapped in it. She ran the store for 31 years. She could tell you the thread pitch on any bolt in that building without looking. When I was 17 and got caught doing something stupid behind the school, she didn't yell at me. She made me spend the whole summer reorganizing the fastener wall, and on the last day she said, "Owen, people are going to tell you who you are your whole life. Don't let them. Show them instead." She died 4 years ago, in February, in the back room with a cup of tea going cold beside her. I found her when I opened up in the morning. 9 months after that, my fiancée Rachel sat across from me at my own kitchen table and told me she couldn't do it. She'd stayed through the funeral because leaving during a funeral would have made her the villain, but she couldn't marry a man whose entire future was a hardware store bleeding $400 a month. She said, "You're not going anywhere, Owen. You're just going to stand in that building until you're old." She wasn't cruel about it. That's the thing. She was gentle, and she was mostly right. And that's why it stuck in me like a splinter I couldn't find with my fingers. So for 4 years, I opened at 7 and closed at 6, and I got very, very good at being alone. I ate dinner standing at the counter. I fixed things nobody had asked me to fix. And when people in town said, "Poor Owen," behind their hands, I let them, because it was easier than explaining that most days I didn't feel poor. I just felt quiet. That was my life. And then a woman in a checkout line told me not to look in her bag. I didn't look. I want that on the record, but I thought about it every single hour for the next 9 days. 9 days later, she walked into my store. The bell did its half-hearted rattle, and I looked up from the register, and there she was, in the same coat, holding a folded $50 bill and looking like she'd rehearsed something in the car. She put it on the counter. "For the groceries," I said. It was 52.18. She said, "I know. I'll bring the rest Friday," and I laughed, which was the wrong thing to do, because her chin came up immediately. "Something funny?" "No," I said. "Ma'am, you drove here to pay me back a grocery bill you didn't ask for, and you brought exact change plans. That's not funny. That's just more honest than most people I know." She stood there for a second. Then she said, "Clara, Clara Bennett, not ma'am. Owen." She looked around the store like she was seeing it properly for the first time. The wooden floor, the fastener wall my grandmother built, the ladder on the rail, the smell of sawdust and machine oil that I stopped noticing when I was about 9 years old. She said, "This is your place?" It was my grandmother's. "It's beautiful," she said, and the way she said it made my throat go strange, because nobody had called it beautiful in years. People called it old. People called it a shame. She said, "Are you hiring?" I said no, because I wasn't, because I couldn't pay myself, let alone anyone else. And then I watched something in her go out like a light, and she nodded fast and said, "Okay, sorry, that was okay," and turned for the door, and I heard myself say, "Wait." She stopped. I said, "Do you know how to run a register?" I ran billing for a 140-bed facility for 6 years. "Do you know anything about hardware?" "No." "Are you willing to learn what a wingnut is?" She said very seriously, "I'm willing to learn what 40 things are." I said, 9 to 3, Tuesday through Saturday. It's 10 an hour, and it's honestly a little insulting, and I'll understand if you say no. She said yes before I finished the sentence. She started the next morning, and I found out 2 things about Clara Bennett in the first week. The first was that she was the most organized human being I have ever met in my life. She rebuilt my entire invoice system in 4 days and found $600 of inventory I'd been misordering since 2021. The second was that she was living in her car. I figured it out on a Thursday. It was 29 degrees, and she came in at 5 minutes to 9 with her hair wet, and there was frost on the inside of the Corolla's back window when I walked past it in the lot, and a folded blanket on the back seat next to a car seat, and a plastic bin of neatly stacked clothes. Nora's booster seat, a stuffed rabbit with one ear. I stood in that parking lot for a long time. When I came back inside, Clara was up on the ladder facing away from me, sorting paint samples, and I said, "Clara." She said, "Hmm." I said, "The apartment upstairs is empty." Her hand stopped. She didn't turn around. I kept going because if I stopped, I wasn't going to start again. "It's 2 bedrooms. The heat works if you hit the radiator. My grandmother lived in it 30 years, and I haven't touched it since she died because I'm a coward. There's a separate entrance off the alley, so you'd never have to walk through the store. There's a lock on the door, and I don't have a key to it." Silence. "I'm not asking you for anything. I'm not, and I had to stop and start over. I'm not that. You'd pay me rent when you can, and if you never can, then you never can." She came down the ladder very slowly. Her face was wet and her jaw was set like she was furious. And I understand now that she was, but not at me. She said, "Do you know what people in this town already say about me?" I said, "No." She said, "Ask anyone. Ask Tyler at the market. Ask the woman at the pharmacy. They'll tell you Clara Bennett stole from dying people." And she said it flat, like she was reading a label. "So before you offer me your grandmother's apartment, you should probably go ask." I said, "I don't need to ask." She said, "Why not?" And I said the truest thing I had. "Because I watched you put rice back on a belt to keep an inhaler." She started crying then, standing in the middle of the paint aisle with a fan deck in her hand, and she didn't make any noise at all, which somehow made it louder. They moved in on a Saturday. Nora carried the rabbit up all 16 stairs by herself and would not accept help. That first month, I learned what it sounds like when a building has people in it. Footsteps over my head at 6:40 in the morning. A 5-year-old singing something with no melody in the stairwell. The pipes knocking when someone ran a bath at night. I'd lived under that ceiling alone for 4 years, and I hadn't understood, not once, that the silence had weight until somebody lifted it off me. Clara was downstairs at 9 sharp every day, and by Christmas the store didn't look like my store anymore. She put a bench by the window because she said old men needed a place to sit and argue about pipe fittings. She started a thing where if a kid came in with a parent, they got a free wooden yardstick, and within 3 weeks, half the children in Millbrook were dragging their parents into a hardware store. Revenue was up 19% in January. I know because she built me a spreadsheet and made me look at it. Nora took over the back corner behind the register and turned it into what she called her office. She had a stool, a coloring book, and a cardboard box she'd labeled "important" in green marker. She was 5, sharp as a tack, and she had asthma bad enough that I learned the sound of her breathing the way you learn a car engine. I could tell from behind a shelf when it was starting to go tight. There was an inhaler in the drawer under the register, one in the apartment, one in the car, and one in my coat pocket, because Clara had put it there without asking and never mentioned it. And that's a kind of trust I don't think I've ever been given before or since. And through all of it, that canvas bag went upstairs every night and came down every morning. She kept it under the counter during the day. She never opened it in front of me. Once I moved it 2 inches to get to a box of light bulbs, and she came across the store so fast she knocked over a display of bungee cords. She said, "Sorry, sorry," and put it back, and neither of us said anything else. If you've ever cared about someone who was carrying something they couldn't set down, you'll understand exactly what those months felt like. In February, it started. A man came in on a Tuesday afternoon in a good coat, and he didn't look at a single item on a single shelf. He walked the aisles once, slowly, looking at faces, and when he got to the register, he asked me if a Clara Bennett worked here. Clara was in the back. I said, "Who's asking?" He smiled and gave me a card. It said Whitfield Legal Group, and under that, a name I'd heard my whole life, Marcus Grant. Not the lawyer, the client. Grantwood Manor sat out on Route 9, a long tan building with a fountain in front of it that had been in every local ad since I was a kid. The Grant family owned it, and 2 others in the county. Marcus Grant sponsored the high school scoreboard. He'd shaken my grandmother's hand at a ribbon cutting in 2009. The lawyer said, "Mr. Grant would like to resolve some outstanding property matters with Ms. Bennett. Nothing hostile. There's some confusion about materials she may have removed from the facility when her employment ended." I said, "Then he can call her." He said he'd rather not create a public situation for her. She's had enough of those. And then he looked around my store, at the fastener wall, at the ladder, at Nora's cardboard box in the corner, and he said, "Nice building. Your family owns it outright?" And he left. I didn't tell Clara that night. I've thought about that a lot since. She came down the next morning, and one look at my face, and she said, "He came here." That evening, after Nora was asleep, Clara sat on the bottom step of the alley staircase with her coat on and told me. She'd worked at Grantwood for 6 years, first as an aide and then in billing. Her mother had been a resident there the last 14 months of her life, emphysema. Clara had taken the job partly to be near her, which is the kind of thing she'd never say out loud, but I could hear underneath it anyway. And in her last year in billing, she started noticing things. Residents billed for physical therapy sessions on days the therapist wasn't in the building. Nutritional supplements charged monthly to people who were on feeding tubes. Wound care listed for a woman who'd been discharged to hospice 2 weeks earlier. Small numbers, hundreds, not thousands, but over 140 beds, 3 facilities, and 6 years, small numbers stopped being small. She went to her supervisor, nothing. She went to the administrator. She was told she'd misread the coding system. Then in March, her mother, who was on the same wing, who Clara saw every single day on her lunch break, was billed $900 for respiratory therapy in a month when Clara had personally sat with her through every scheduled session and knew for a fact that the therapist had come exactly twice. She said, "That's when I stopped asking." She started copying, not stealing, copying. Billing summaries, session logs, staffing schedules that proved who was actually in the building on which days. 9 months of it, printed at the library so nothing would show on the facility network. In a manila folder she carried in a canvas bag. Her mother died in September. In October, someone reported that resident belongings had gone missing from the Cedar Wing. A gold wedding band, $200 in cash, a watch. Clara's locker was searched. The watch was in it. She said, "I never touched it. I don't even know whose it was." She was fired the same day. No charges, Grant declined to press, which the sheriff's department wrote down as generosity, and which Clara understood perfectly well as strategy, because charges mean discovery, and discovery means a lawyer looks in your files. Instead, they just made a phone call to every long-term care facility in 4 counties. She was 31 days from being unemployed to being evicted. She sold her mother's ring for the car repair. She and Nora slept in that Corolla for 6 weeks before she walked into my store, and that whole time she carried the folder. She said, "That's what's in the bag." She was staring at the alley wall. "That's why I told you not to look, because the second you know what's in it, you're in it too, and you'd already paid for my groceries. I wasn't going to let you pay for anything else." I sat down on the step next to her. I said, "Clara." She said, "Don't." I said, "I believe you." She turned and looked at me, and her eyes were red and furious and terrified, and she said, "You don't even know me." And I said, "I know you re-alphabetized my entire hardware store, and I know you cried when a kid gave you a drawing of a hammer, and I know there's an inhaler in my coat pocket that I didn't put there. I don't need a folder." She didn't say anything, neither did I. We just sat there on the step in the cold with the alley light buzzing over us, and after a long time she put her head on my shoulder, and I didn't move a muscle for 20 minutes because I was afraid she'd remember she'd done it. 3 days later, the town started talking. It came fast and organized, the way things do when someone pays for them. A post in the Millbrook community group about being careful who you hire, then a comment naming her. Then someone claiming a cousin who'd worked at Grantwood and knew all about it. A woman I'd sold storm windows to for 11 years came in, bought nothing, and asked me whether I really thought it was appropriate with a child in the building. 2 of my regular contractors stopped coming. My insurance carrier called about an unrelated matter that turned out not to be unrelated at all. And on the second Saturday in March, Marcus Grant walked into my store himself. He was in his 60s, silver hair, a coat worth more than my truck. He stood in the middle of the floor with his hands in his pockets and said warmly, like an old friend, "Owen, I knew your grandmother." I said, "I know you did." He looked at Clara behind the register. He said, "Miss Bennett, I understand things have been difficult. I'd like to make them less difficult." Nobody moved. He said, $25,000, a signed statement that the documents in your possession were misinterpreted and their return. And I'll make some calls, and by summer you'll have your license back and a job at a facility in Columbus with a salary you can raise a child on. And then, still smiling, still warm, you've got a little girl who needs medication every month. This is the kindest offer anyone is going to make you. The store went completely silent. Old Ray Pinter was standing by the paint mixer with a can in his hand, not pretending not to listen. Clara came out from behind the register. She was shaking. I could see it from 6 feet away. And her voice came out very quiet and very level. She said, "In August, my mother asked me why the nurse never came. I told her she was mistaken. I told my dying mother she was confused, because I trusted the schedule on the wall more than I trusted her. She took one more step. You billed her account $940 that month. I'm not selling that back to you for $25,000. I wouldn't sell it back to you for everything you own." Grant's face didn't change, but something behind it did. He said, "You're going to lose." She said, "Probably." He said, "And him too," and he tipped his head toward me, and there was nothing warm left in it. That's a family building, isn't it? Free and clear. That's a lot to put on the table for a woman you've known 5 months. And I said, and I've never been so calm in my life, "Mr. Grant, my grandmother taught me the thread pitch on every bolt in this building. She also taught me not to let people tell me who I am." He left. The bell rattled. Ray Pinter set down his paint can and said to nobody, "Well, I'll be damned." And that night, upstairs, with Nora asleep and the radiator clanking, Clara stood in the kitchen doorway of my grandmother's apartment and said, "You should have taken it back, what you said to him." I said, "I meant it." She crossed the room and kissed me. It wasn't gentle and it wasn't careful, and she was crying before she got there. When she pulled back, she said, "This is going to cost you everything." I said, "Then it costs me everything." She said, "I'm serious, Owen." I said, "So am I. I've been alone in this building for 4 years and I was fine. I don't want to be fine anymore." And then everything went wrong at once. It was the second week of April. I came down at 6:30 in the morning, and the back door of the store was standing open, and the frame around the lock was split like kindling. Nothing was gone, not the register, not the tools, not the $400 in the drawer. But every drawer in the office was pulled out. My grandmother's file cabinets were emptied onto the floor, and the space under the register counter where a canvas bag usually sat had been swept clean with somebody's arm. I stood in the middle of it and I thought, they did it. They actually did it. Then I heard Clara on the stairs. She came in holding 2 mugs of coffee, took one look, and set them both down on the counter without spilling a drop. And she said, "It's not here." I said, "What?" She said, "The folder. It hasn't been in this building since February." I stared at her. She said, "I made 3 copies the week Grant's lawyer came in. One's in a safe deposit box at First Ohio in Ashland under my aunt's name. One's with a woman named Dolores Vance, who worked Cedar Wing for 19 years and got let go 8 months before I did. And the original's been sitting in a file at Frank Delaney's office since the day after your neighbor asked you if it was appropriate to have a child in the building." I said, "Frank Delaney, the lawyer?" She said, "Frank Delaney, who buys wood glue from you every 3 weeks and always says he'll pay Friday." I sat down on an overturned drawer and put my head in my hands, and I laughed until I couldn't breathe. She'd been carrying that bag every day for 2 months to give them something to look for. Frank Delaney was 68 years old, worked out of a 2-room office over the flower shop, and had exactly one paralegal who was also his sister-in-law. He'd never taken a case against anyone with real money in his life. He read Clara's folder over 4 days and then called us in and said, "I've been practicing law in this county for 41 years, and I've never wanted to win anything this badly." He filed a wrongful termination and defamation action. Grant's people filed to have it dismissed, then filed a countersuit for theft of proprietary records, then subpoenaed Clara's finances, then subpoenaed mine. Frank did what Frank did, which was slow, unglamorous, and relentless. He subpoenaed the staffing schedules, not the billing, the schedules. The one thing Grantwood had never thought to reconcile, because nobody audits who was in the building. He put the therapist's time cards next to the therapy invoices for a 14-month period, and the mismatch was so wide you could have driven a truck through it. And then Dolores Vance came forward, and then a man named Curtis Ambrose, whose father had died at the Sycamore facility, called Frank after his wife read something in the county paper. and then two more. By July, there were 11 families, and it wasn't a wrongful termination case anymore. The Ohio Attorney General's Medicaid Fraud Control Unit opened a file in August. Those were the hardest months of my life. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. Business dropped 30%, then came back, then dropped again every time someone posted something. I had to sell my grandmother's truck. There was a week in September when I genuinely did not know if I could make the supplier payment, and Clara found me at 11 at night in the back room with the books open, and she didn't say anything comforting. She sat down, pulled the ledger toward her, and said, "Move over. You're doing this wrong." Nora turned 6 in October. We had it in the store, after hours, with the lights off except the string of work lamps Clara hung down the fastener wall, and 11 kids ran up and down my aisles, screaming while Ray Pinter manned the paint mixer like a bartender. Nora blew out the candles and then came and stood in front of me very seriously and said, "Owen, I made a wish, but Mommy says you're not allowed to know it." I said, "That's the rule." She said, "It was about you, though," and she walked off. Clara was on the other side of the room, and she'd heard it, and she looked at me across all those kids and all that noise, and neither of us said a word. The hearing was the first week of December, 13 months, almost to the day after a card got declined in a grocery store. The Millbrook Courthouse is 140 years old, and it has terrible heating, and the benches are hard as church pews, and they were full. Half the town came. Grant had 4 attorneys at his table. We had Frank Delaney and his sister-in-law. Clara wore the gray blazer she'd bought at the thrift store on Warren Avenue, and she'd ironed it 3 times. In the hallway before we went in, she said, "I think I'm going to be sick." I said, "Look at me." She did. I said, "You're not walking in there to convince anyone you're honest. You already are. You're walking in there to make them write it down." Grant's lawyers went first, and they were good. They painted her as a disgruntled employee with a grudge and a stolen watch. They put the locker search in evidence. They made it sound reasonable. I watched the faces in the gallery, and I felt the room start to tip. Then Frank stood up, and he was slow, and he shuffled his papers, and he looked like a man who'd been handed the wrong file. He called the physical therapist. He asked her one question. Was she in the Cedar Wing building on the 14th of March? She said no. She'd been at the Sycamore facility. She was there every other Tuesday. It was in her contract. Frank held up an invoice. Then he did it again, and again, and again. 11 times, 11 dates, 11 invoices, and by the 6th one, the room had gone so quiet you could hear the radiator ticking. And one of Grant's attorneys had stopped writing. He called Dolores Vance, who testified that she'd raised the same concern in 2019 and been moved to nights. He called Curtis Ambrose, who read out his father's final statement of account with his hands shaking so badly the paper rattled into the microphone. And then he called Clara. She was steady. That's what I remember. She started quiet and she got stronger, not louder, just more certain. And she walked the court through the coding system line by line, like she was teaching a class. And at the end, Frank asked her why she hadn't taken the $25,000. She was quiet for a second. Then she said, "Because my mother asked me a question in August and I gave her the wrong answer. I can't fix that." This was the only other thing I could do. Grant's lead attorney stood up to cross-examine her about the watch. He asked her if it had been found in her locker. She said yes. He asked if she'd taken it. She said no. He asked, with a little smile, how the court was supposed to know the difference. And Frank Delaney, 68 years old, wood glue on credit, said, "Your Honor, since counsel raises it, I direct the court to Exhibit 41. The facility's own key card access log for the staff locker room on October 3rd. Grant's table went very still. There were 4 entries after Clara clocked out that day. One of them was the administrator. The judge, Eleanor Reyes, who I'd sold a snow shovel to 2 winters running, took a long, long look at that page. The ruling came down in January. Clara won on every count. The defamation finding was the one that mattered to her. The money mattered less than the sentence in the judgment that said the allegations against her were unsupported by any credible evidence and appeared to have been advanced for the purpose of discrediting a reporting employee. That's the part she read out loud, twice, standing in the middle of my store with her coat still on. Grantwood was a different matter, and it took another 18 months, and Marcus Grant did not go to prison, which I've made a kind of uneasy peace with. He paid one of the largest Medicaid fraud settlements in the state that year. He lost his operating license on two facilities. The fountain out front of Grantwood got shut off and never turned back on. 11 families got letters, and on the day the settlement was announced, a woman I'd sold storm windows to for 11 years came into my store, bought nothing, and stood in front of Clara for a long moment and said, "I owe you an apology." And Clara said, "Okay," which I thought was the most gracious thing I'd ever heard anybody say. We got married the following June in the alley behind the store because Clara said the courthouse had used up its welcome. Ray Pinter set up folding chairs. Frank Delaney cried harder than anyone. Nora carried the rings on a cushion and dropped them once and announced loudly that it wasn't her fault. Clara wore a simple dress and my grandmother's ring, which I'd been carrying in my coat pocket for 4 months next to an inhaler. And when she walked down that alley past the dumpster and the buzzing light where she'd once put her head on my shoulder, I understood that I had been standing in this building for 4 years, not because I was stuck, but because I was waiting, and I just hadn't known the difference. Nora started calling me Dad on an ordinary Thursday in September, in the truck, in a sentence about a permission slip, without stopping. I had to pull over. She said, "Are you okay?" I said, "Yep." She said, "Your face is doing a thing." Our son was born 2 years later. We named him Ruth something in the end, Reuben for my grandmother. Close enough that Clara said Ruth would have approved, and far enough that the kid wouldn't have to explain it his whole life. The store is fine, better than fine. Clara runs the books, and the second location we opened in Ashland, and there's a bench by the window where old men argue about pipe fittings, and every kid who walks in still gets a wooden yardstick. Sometimes people come in from 3 counties over because they read about the case, and they stand in my aisles pretending to shop, and Clara always knows and never says anything. She keeps that canvas bag in the closet upstairs, empty. She's never once explained why, and I've never once asked. And every so often, when the store is closed and the lights are off except the ones over the fastener wall, I think about a Tuesday in November and a woman leaning close to me in a freezing parking lot to whisper the strangest thing anyone has ever said to me. She asked me not to look in her bag. She was carrying 9 months of proof that a powerful man was stealing from dying people, and she was carrying it alone in a car with a 5-year-old asleep in the back seat, and she was so certain that the world would make her pay for it that she tried to protect a stranger who'd spent $52 on her. So I want to tell you what I've learned, standing in this building where I've stood my whole life. You will almost never get to save anybody. That's not how it works. But every once in a while, a person will walk past you carrying something too heavy, and you'll get a choice, the smallest possible choice, the kind that costs you a grocery bill and 40 seconds of your dignity, and you'll never, ever know what you're actually choosing. I didn't look in her bag. I just kept showing up until she was ready to open it. And when she finally did, what was inside wasn't a secret at all. It was my whole life waiting on me to be brave enough to stay.